We're in the integumentary lab. So in this lab, we're going to look at a lot of models, and you need to be able to identify those skin models structure. So the model we use is this one. So first one, you need to be able to identify those three layers. Epidermis is the A, dermis is the B, and hypodermis layer. So every time you see fat, you know you reach the hypodermis layer. So now let's look at the sublayers. The epidermis layers can be divided into 5 sublayers, from the stratum germinativum and to the stratum corneum. So you need to be able to identify which one is which. In the lab practical, I will point at one layer and ask you which one is which. So the top layer, number 1, that's the stratum corneum, and number 2, that's the transparent layer, that's stratum lucidum. And number 3 is stratum granulosum, number 4 is stratum spinosum, and number 5 is stratum basal, also called stratum germinativum. So these 5 sublayers. And your dermis layers only divide into 2 layers. So you have the papillary layer, about 20%, and the other 80%, that's the reticular layer. And when you see the fat, you know you are in the hypodermis, also called the subcutaneous layer. Now let's look at some accessory structure. So this is the model, and this will be the model I'm going to use to test you. So first, those 5 sublayers in epidermis, stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, eventually go to stratum basal. So these 5 layers, and these are the thick skin. Now let's look at some accessory structure. That's the hair, and outside those pink, purple structure, that's the hair follicle. So hair follicle, they are supporting cells. They're different from hair. The inside one is the hair, outside is hair follicle. And this muscle, that's the pili muscle. So that's the pili muscle. When they contract, make hair stand out. And now let's look at this one. That's the sebaceous gland. Sebaceous gland is an oil gland. So if you cut it, sebaceous gland look like this. You produce oil. And now let's look at those 2 different sweat glands. You have the merocrine and apocrine. So the merocrine is smaller one. So this white one are the merocrine sweat gland. Merocrine sweat gland. Merocrine sweat gland. And now let's look at the apocrine. Apocrine is the funky gland, so they're usually bigger. And that's the apocrine sweat gland. It's bigger. And let's look at 2 sensor. This one called the Pacinian capsule. Pacinian capsule, that's the pressure sensor. So that's usually deeper. That's the Pacinian capsule. And that's the touch sensor. Tactile capsule, that's the touch sensor. I also put this picture here. This would be the picture I used to in the lab practical. So you can practice, and this is not labeled. So you can practice, use this to practice, point at each one of them and say what's this, what's that. And the key are all here. So this covered this part. Epidermis, we have 3 sublayers. We talk about all of them. You need to be able to identify them. The dermis, 2 layers. And we talk about the mesenteric capsule, that's the touch sensor. Pacinian capsule, that's the pressure sensor. Pacinian capsule is deeper. And free nerve ending, that's the one feel the pain sensation. And hypodermis, you see the fat that's in the hypodermis. And the hair, I only ask you to identify the hair and hair follicle. So the hair follicle are the supporting cells outside. And we talk about the sebaceous gland, that's the oil gland. So that's all in the model. The skin slides. Okay, we're going to look at 2 slides. We use, that's the first picture. The first picture, you need to be identify those 5 sublayers under the microscope. So the skin under the microscope will look like this. So this part, that's the dermis, and that's epidermis. Start from the stratum basal, also called the stratum germinativum, and stratum spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and the top layer is stratum cornea. So you need to be able to identify those 5 layers. And this shows you some accessory structure. So that's the epidermis, and that's the dermis. So you have the papillary layer, reticular layer. And every time you see the fat, and you know that's in the hypodermis, also called the subq area. So these slides, you need to be able to identify, okay, that's the hair, and outside the lighter one, there's the hair follicle. So they're different, hair and hair follicle. And that's the sebaceous gland, that's the oil gland next to the hair, and then they have a lot of bubble, that's the sebaceous gland. And the pili muscle, that's the erector pili muscle, is pretty small. You're going to push, make the hair stand out. So these are the hair gland.